Okay, and I want to welcome everybody to coming out on a Thursday night. I'm Joan Van Beesler, and I'm with Unitarian Universalist Justice Ohio, and you are here for our monthly legislative update, but this is a very special and wonderful update because we're going to be welcoming two presenters who are going to be looking at the soap opera that is taking place in our Ohio Statehouse right now in the House of Representatives. And we have Catherine Turcer, who is the director of Ohio Common Cause. Wave hello, Catherine. Absolutely wonderful. And then there is Maria Bruno, who is the Civic Engagement Coordinator and Policy Analyst for the Coalition on Homelessness and Housing in Ohio, as well as Director of Ohio Votes. And wave hello, Maria. And these are two powerhouse women. So I am just absolutely thrilled that they were able to come in tonight and give us some updates on, you know, like I said, this drama and trauma that we see playing before our very eyes in the Ohio Statehouse, in the midst of summer, in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of July. So to ground us tonight, I want to start with just a quote from John Lewis. And then I'm going to turn it over first to Catherine and then to Maria to give us some of their views, and then we'll have a little discussion. Okay. So John Lewis once said that freedom is not a state. It is an act. It is not some enchanted garden perched high on a distant plateau where we can finally sit down and rest. He said, freedom is the continuous action that we must all take, and each generation must do its part to create an even more fair and even more just society. So that is what we're grounding ourselves in tonight, is that push for the more fair, more just society that he spoke of, he dreamed of, and showed us the way. So Catherine, as I said, she's the director of Common Cause Ohio, which is up to its ears in alligators right now as we head into the height of election season. And I'm going to let you start us off with this soap opera.
Well, hi, everybody. I wanted to thank you all for inviting me to come and talk to you about what is happening at the Statehouse. And I think that Joan aptly called it a soap opera. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to walk us through, a little bit about what happened, but I'm also going to highlight the different characters and elected officials and lobbyists that are part of the scandal. And so one of the things I want to highlight is that for many of us, we were very aware this time last year that there was something deeply wrong with House Bill 6. There was something horrifying about the ads that we saw, if you remember those horrible xenophobic ads. And when people have said, are you surprised about the scandal? It seemed to me that the scandal was there. What was somehow surprising was that Larry Householder was actually arrested. And I think for many of us, we can go back to 2004 when he was investigated the first time that he was the Speaker of the House. And, lots of strong arming, some money laundering that was involved in that Householder memo. It was very clear that something was not right. And yet, the wheels of justice didn't seem to turn. And I've often thought it's so very easy to become cynical. And I think, as we think about the things that have happened in the past 16 years, one, we know the last Speaker of the House was being investigated by the FBI, and he decided to resign. When I started this PowerPoint, we did not have Larry Householder resigning. So when I started, it said 2019 through present. And so today, the House got together and unanimously decided that that in fact he should be stripped of the role of being Speaker, his leadership role. And clearly that's a really good thing. I included this quote here from Bill Seitz because I think one of the things that has been difficult to understand is how Larry Householder managed to play the game and get House Bill 6 passed, and what this $30 million enterprise, how do you do this amount of money when it comes to dark money to influence elections to get the candidates that you actually want into office? And then, thinking big picture, you're talking $60 million to then move a campaign to bamboozle the public about House Bill 6, and then to fight the referendum. And, as we're thinking about just the sheer amount of money, it's interesting to think about, Larry Householder at the center of this, thinking about how to use the rules that are in place to make it so that he could set it up to enrich himself, his friends, and at the end of the day, completely enrich Company A. Now, I don't know if you all remember that House Bill 6 was actually called creates the Ohio Clean Air Program. That is how they described House Bill 6. Now, as we're thinking about this scandal, there was the money that was spent, the dark money that was spent to get Householder's people in place, so to get his people elected. So that was one part of this scandal. That notion of like, okay, if I get the right people elected to be in the House to support me to be Speaker, and they're going to agree to vote for things that I want, that puts everything in place. Then there's the whole campaign to actually educate the public about how House Bill 6 works. And then there was the attack on the referendum. Now, I'm going to go through kind of a series of different people. So this is Neil Clark, hired gun lobbyist. As of last week, before the arrest happened, he had 36 clients. So just think of he in a variety of different areas. So everything from payday lending to education. In the documents the FBI had, they described him as the Speaker's hitman. And I think one of the things that is interesting is that he allegedly spent nearly $500,000 in a single day to hire 15 signature collection firms so that they would not collect signatures, so that in fact it would be much more difficult for the people fighting House Bill 6 to collect the signatures. And when asked, when he was basically caught on tape talking about, why they should fight the referendum so hard, this is what he said. He said, it sends a message to everyone. If you attack a member, we're going to rip your dick off. So now, clearly, vulgar man, behind the scenes, kind of helping Householder orchestrate all of the different levers that needed to get into motion to pass House Bill 6. Now, we have Matt Borges. Now, the thing that's interesting about Matt Borges, speaking in 2004, when we went back to when Larry Householder was having his difficulties and the Householder memo was out and the FBI was investigating, at the same time, there was a scandal that was going on at Joe Dieter's office. And I don't know if you remember, he was the treasurer. Because of the tobacco money, there was a lot of money coming in for the state of Ohio to invest. And it turns out that what he was doing, and it turns out that the henchmen are the only one who actually pled guilty to this, but basically they were steering contracts or giving preferential treatment to people who gave campaign contributions not directly to Joe Dieters, but to, for example, the Hamilton County Republican Party. So it was this whole notion of the money doesn't go directly to Dieters, it goes to these county parties to then be given to Dieters. And this is the thing that Borges actually ended up pleading guilty to giving preferential treatment to certain investment brokers. And so he really worked his way back up to, he expunged his record, he went through that process. He actually worked his way to becoming the chair of the Republican Party. And he ended up leaving. Basically, he was not a favorite of the Trump, not a favorite that way. And James Dukin has since taken over. But as we look at this, he was actually censored last month because he was supporting a PAC that supports Joe Biden. But what you all should know is he was a middleman in the attempt to stop the referendum. And this is important because he was in the process of trying to figure out how to get information on the campaign that was fighting for the referendum, the ones that actually wanted to referendum House Bill 6. He was caught on tape talking about, would you be willing to do this and I can give you some cash. And we'll talk a little bit about that later because I'm going to also introduce you to some of the people who, that shared with the FBI what they considered to be unethical behavior. This is Juan Cespedes of the Oxley group. He worked at the same time Matt Borges was at the Ohio Treasurer's office. He was there. He was appointed by John Kasich to be on the Ohio Civil Rights Commission. And what's interesting is there's a texting message that were released in that 81-page affidavit from the FBI that shows texting between Juan Cespedes and Jeffrey Longstreth discussing Company A1's or First Energy's approval of $15 million to help move House Bill 6. In the affidavit, it actually alleges that he received $600,000 from Generation Now and then additional money from, once again, a company believed to be First Energy. Now, one of the things that, there's some things that we do not know. There are lots of things that are alleged in this. Lots of things that are alleged. There are things we do know and that we can say, okay, I saw that ad. I know that, something really smells here. We know there were some really terrible kind of political machinations going on. There are a lot of things that are alleged. And so I'm going through this, it's important to remember that, but it's also important to think about the kinds of things that are going to be revealed as we get further on. The FBI will be slowly releasing more information so we have a better understanding of what was actually happening. So this is Jeff Longstreth of JP&L Associates. Essentially, his organization was to buy to purchase the ads. So in the documents, you can see that Generation Now was giving money to JP&L, and JP&L would place the ad buys. And so, as we're thinking about the transferring of these accounts, he was part of that. He was also Larry Householder's chief political aide, and it's really described as central kind of to the political strategy. Now we're getting to Company A. Now, the thing that's really interesting in the complaint is just like the dark money, and we were all like, Generation Now, that has to be First Energy. This time last year, we would see these things and be like, okay, that's just First Energy. But we all were, because it was dark money, because it wasn't clear, we were all left with saying, we believe it, we think this. And yet in the affidavit that the FBI released on the 21st of July, we're still in a position where we are filling in the blanks. And in fact, one of the things that the U.S. attorney said was, you know what company I'm talking about, but because we have not actually made the legal kinds of things that we need to do, we're in the process of subpoenas, etc. We're not actually naming. But this company A is in fact First Energy, which is based here in Ohio, of course. Many of us will remember that its old name was Ohio Edison. The thing that is a little complicated when we start talking about First Energy is that the bailout was for First Energy Solutions, which is now Energy Harbor. And so, what they wanted was a bailout for their failing nuclear plants. The most famous one is like in Toledo area, which is the Davis-Besse plant. I wanted to highlight that in the FBI documents that they released, they also said that there were 84 phone contacts with First Energy CEO Charles Jones between February 2017 and July 2019. Now, phone contacts, that could be text, it could be phone calls, but it's very clear there was a connection there. So this is the U.S. attorney. At the press conference on July 21st, he was asked, about this nonprofit 501c4, and he said not a single dime of it flowed to any social programs. That it was in fact a nonprofit that was simply created to move this bailout of First Energy Solutions, now Energy Harbor. Jim Province of the Toledo Bay actually asked if the whole householder scandal would have happened if there was good disclosure. And DeVillers answered, I don't see how that's actually possible. So now one of the things that is very clear to me is that, they're talking about repealing House Bill 6. And there's some conversations about doing something about dark money. But at the end of the day, legislators make the rules that guide their own campaigns, and we need to do what we can to be absolutely sure that this doesn't come off the table, that we clearly have an ongoing system of play-to-play. All you have to do is go back even to 2004 and a few years back during the Cliff Rosenberger era. We need to be very clear that things need to change at the Statehouse. So I did want to highlight a couple, I've been kind of covering the villains of the story. I wanted to highlight this person as well. So individual 1 in the complaint is a former prosecutor. He is a member of the state school board. And he called the FBI tip line in March. And he reported a conversation in which he was told that, in November of 2018, he was told that, hey, money was actually used to influence, the races of people that the speaker preferred and that would actually end up voting to put him as speaker. And so he knew that it was this candidate, this J. Todd Smith, who ended up winning only by 87 votes. And he knew that there was this last minute money of $500,000. He was able to say that householders people clearly offered to do the same for him. And it is one of the things that got them thinking really broadly beyond the kind of shenanigans that were going on with the referendum to go and think, more about the dark money that was going on during the 2008 election. So this is Tyler Ferriman. He is in the complaint, he's CHS1. And he claims that Matt Borges offered him $15,000 to basically be a spy in the pro-referendum campaign. And he actually agreed to wear a wire. He wore a wire. And I think, one of the things that was really interesting is, you know, here is somebody who made a really ethical decision. Matt Borges was a friend. And you know, he knew that what it was the wrong, you know, this was wrong, and that he needed to report it to the FBI, which is what he did. And he agreed to wear a wire, and he was actually able to get Matt Borges on tape. And so, you know, as we're thinking about this scandal and its impact on Ohioans, it's important to remember the people that pushed this forward so that we could keep having a conversation. Now, this is really complicated. And I think what's really important here is that the flow of the money, you know, there's clearly money that, if, you know, obviously this is an alleged allegation, but we're talking about secret money flowing from First Energy into Generation Now, then going out to other front groups to purchase ads and attempt to influence the election, the election, and then to influence public perception of House Bill 6 to make it about, you know, jobs, and then ultimately to address public perception related to people that were challenging the, you know, what we would think of as welfare for a corporation, right? The folks that were challenging the notion that taxpayers should bail out nuclear energy and coal energy, that to have a create an environment where they would be considered to be seen as part of the Chinese government trying to get your information and trying to create this kind of misinformation. And so, you know, I wouldn't think too much about this, except to say that we're talking about a lot of money moving around in an attempt to get a bailout for more than $1 billion. And so you're talking about 60 million to get more than $1 billion. And you know, it's just incredibly sad because at the end of the day, the taxpayers are the ones that actually are bailing out, you know, these failing nuclear energy and old coal plants. So just incredibly sad. Now, for some of us, we may be thinking, well, okay, so that's what's going on in the Statehouse. I think it's also important for us to be thinking a little bit about what's going on when it comes to the governor's office as well. And I'm just gonna draw attention to this. One of the things, Dan McCarthy, who is the Director of Legislative Affairs, so his main guy for going over to the Statehouse to advance the governor's agenda, was in fact a lobbyist for First Energy when he was at Success Group. He was also the president of Partners for Progress. One of the things I think is hilarious is all the different names for these kind of C4 dark money things. So he actually ran a dark money group, which appears to be part of the affidavit because there is an incorporation date that is the same as the energy pass-through that was in the previous overview. And so we don't know exactly what happened. You know, at this point, Dan McCarthy is denying any wrongdoing. One of the things we do know is that the governor went from, oh, well, HB 6 might have had an ugly past, but it was, it's good legislation, it's good policy, to saying, okay, we need to reconsider this and repeal this right after it came out that McCarthy was allegedly part of this. So it's worth keeping that stuff in the back of your mind. Now, Governor Mike DeWine has said this. He says that he's all about transparency. And what I found worrisome in the way he's talked about it is I think that as much transparency that we can write into our laws is consistent with the United States Supreme Court. You know, he wants to do it in a way that matches what is in Citizens United. And I think for too long, we have not had good disclosure. So, many of us on this Zoom will remember that in January of 2010, Citizens United versus the Federal Elections Commission was determined. It was a very unusual decision. Most of us can't quite wrap our heads around it, but the Supreme Court essentially said that corporations have First Amendment rights. They have the right to free speech, and specifically that they have the right to pay for political advertisements. Now, in the decision, there was the lines along the, how can it possibly be corrupting? It can't be corrupting because they're not actually coordinated with candidates. These are just political advertisements. Well, that's incredibly naive, right? I mean, one of the things that we do know as we've gotten further out is that these entities are coordinated with candidates all the time. And we do not have strong anti-coordination rules. So one of the things we do need, right, it seems very clear, is we do need good anti-coordination rules. In fact, the Supreme Court assumed that there would be good anti-coordination rules. They also talked about disclosure, and they actually emphasized in an 8-1 decision, anybody who who won? One was Clarence Thomas, but in this 8-1 decision in Citizens United versus FEC, they highlighted the merits of transparency and the ability for stockholders to hold the corporation accountable, the importance of us being able to see and considering how it's impacting the policy interests and looking at, well, how do you judge an ad unless you can consider the source? And so it's so helpful to have disclosure so we can make informed decisions and give proper weight to different messages. And, none of this could have happened if Citizens United wasn't determined that corporations could have First Amendment rights. So clearly, if we change the Constitution, if we amend the Constitution, we could say, hey, corporations can't actually do this. Corporations, including 501c3s, C4s, LLCs, all of the different ways that you could think of different ways of corporations, none of them would have First Amendment rights if it weren't for Citizens United. However, it is going to take us a while to actually amend the Constitution. In the meantime, it is in fact constitutional to require disclosure. And I would encourage us all as we go into this period to, we are right before an election. We need to get candidates on the record talking about the importance of disclosure so that we can actually shine a light on dark money, because it's nearly impossible to address corruption unless we have a full picture. So at this point, I wondered if you might actually have some questions. Maria's going to talk about a lot of things after I conclude, but I thought you might have questions before we move to her. Have I stunned you into silence?
You can unmute yourself and ask, or you can type it into the chat box. Is there legislation that we favor to correct this, is one question.
So a number of different bills have been introduced. The one that has bipartisan support right now is House Bill 737. Now, there are some challenges with 737, and I am in the process of trying to better understand it. So what I would say about 737 is that it doesn't do a good job of disclosure of what we would call cover transfers. So this is really typical. One 501c4 gives to another 501c4. So when that 501c4 reports It's reporting this not, Americans for apple pie giving to Ohioans for good government, where what we really need, we need to get back to the who is funding Americans for apple pie, right? And so we're missing some of so there's some disclosure that is really not covered that needs to be addressed. The other thing is there are different ways to think about disclosure. There's the disclosure that we get when we go to the Secretary of State's site and we're like, look it up, or reporters do kind of a deep dive to look at things. And then there's the disclosure that we see when we're sitting on our couches and we're watching television. And, we think of those as disclaimers at the end. Well, it's not enough. Like in the bill 737, the disclosure is give their name. Well, what we really need to do it's not enough just to be transparent. You need to give people meaningful disclosure. And so some states have required the top 3 donors. And so that would be a way where we could get a little bit of more information. But at minimum, we should have an address. We should have a website. We should have a contact person on all of those ads. And so, yes, I'm hoping to get more information, take a deeper dive. And I've been working with the Brennan Center for Justice and others to help me figure out, what's missing. And so hopefully I'll be able to give you more information, even a week from now. Any other questions?
Yeah, somebody asked, how does move to amend fit into this?
So fortunately, we have some move to amend folks that are actually on this phone call. What I want to be really clear is there are the incremental things that we can do, like shining a light on dark money, and there's the big, broad, let's do something about giving corporations First Amendment rights. Michael or anybody else want to jump in?
Michael Greenman, I'm with Move to Amend and the Interfaith Caucus of Move to Amend for the last 10 years or so. And it's always good to hear this topic being discussed because money certainly is a tremendously influential and destructive power in our politics. But with talking about Citizens United and doing away with Citizens United, we actually miss the primary energy behind corporations and their ability to get away with everything they get away with. And that is that it's not just First Amendment rights that they have. They have a number of amendments that are given to them over the years by the Supreme Court of the United States, which basically give them the same powers as we the people. And in a court case where you have a corporation that's trying to get something through against a city, a county, or a state, or a person, or a group, there's just no way that anything but the corporation is going to win with the money and the legal force they can throw at a case. So while doing away with Citizens United would be a wonderful thing, it would not really change the whole dynamic of corporate control, because that is behind the scenes for many people. And that is why Move to Amend was created actually just before Citizens United came into being. We knew it was going to happen, but it was created because back in 1886, corporations were first given their constitutional rights as people with the granting of personal rights for amendment, the 14th Amendment, which was designed to protect African-American former slaves. In the first 50 years, I think all but about 50 of the 500 or so cases that came before courts were about corporate rights to equal treatment under the law with people. And that's the problem that Move to Amend addresses at a sort of a foundational, systemic level. And we see this as the sine qua non, the only thing that will really change. Because of this, the day after the amendment is passed, a corporation going to a court of law and telling a judge, you can't decide against me because of my right to the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the First, the whatever it is. And the judge is going to say, I beg your pardon. What amendment is that you have the rights to? And it sort of all goes out the window right away. But that's a big step. And we Americans, with this country, does not seem to be willing to bite that off. And my main concern as the Interfaith Caucus is not even any of this stuff. It's the climate crisis. And that is what's going to kill us all, regardless of what we do about money, because it's the existential threat that we face, and it's coming closer every day. And we're talking all the time about all these other things we do, which are important. But the simple fact is, if we amend the Constitution to eliminate corporate constitutional rights and limit the speech, we can address climate change, but we can also address, without the interference of corporations and money, everything else, just about, that has been going wrong in this country for how many years? Sorry, thanks a lot.
I just actually want to back that up. So, you know, part of what I'm going to talk about is things that I studied in my law and politics class, which was with Dan Takaji, which I'm sure many of you have known or seen on a panel or something. But one of the first things he teaches us is basically that, you know, the whole money is speech decision was made kind of a long time ago. So the two kind of hinges of Citizens United is that money is speech and that corporations are people. So people plus speech equals First Amendment rights. So the money actually is a sticky point because, you know, if someone is like, you know, money can be speech, it's just not always speech, right? It's like a square is not or a square is a rectangle kind of situation. But ultimately, I agree with Michael. I think the real underlying issue is that a corporation has any sort of rights that extend to people. And like, I just want to kind of highlight Elizabeth Warren's famous quote is, if corporations are people, then they're by design sociopaths. And that's true because they are literally legally obligated to prioritize shareholder profits, which means they are obligated to act in self-interest. So those things kind of can't coexist. So I just wanted to second that I think ultimately the underlying problem is that corporations are not human beings and should not have the rights that human beings have.
Got a couple other. Go ahead, Catherine.
I was some questions in the chat. So one question was, what do we know about the new speaker, Bob Cupp? So one of the things that's interesting about Bob Cupp is he was in the Senate when they passed campaign finance reform in 1995. He was the chair of the committee that moved Senate Bill 8, if you all remember that one at all. It's only the wonkiest of nerds, and we have to be a little old to remember that. But the thing that's interesting about that is it was the first time that they established campaign contribution limits. And there were things that they did during that time period that set a precedent for where we are now. We should be aware that, as you know, when he went from the Senate, he then later became a Supreme Court justice. He is one of the justices that did receive money from First Energy. One of the things that's important to remember is that any of the decisions that are made at the Public Utilities Commissions, they end up being decided whether they're constitutional or not. You know, when the Consumer Council takes that case, it goes to the Supreme Court. So First Energy on a very regular basis has contributed heavily to candidates for the justice of the Supreme Court. And then, of course, we know that they're very unlikely to recuse. What I would say is that, you know, Bob Cupp hopefully will be a step up from the last two speakers. But, you know, one of the things we're going to be doing is learning a little bit more about Bob Cupp. He is from Lima, Ohio, and I would encourage all of us to, you know, check him out. I did put the complaint into the chat, so people that want to take a deeper dive, I'd encourage you to do that. You know, some of it's a little frustrating because of pseudonyms, but it is also interesting to try to, you know, I wonder who Representative 7 actually is. You know, it is an interesting, it's an interesting read and well worth checking. Now, Greg asked me about Neil Clark spending nearly $500,000 to basically contract people to do no work. And so, you know, should they have at that point called the FBI because they were being contracted to do no work? It's a good question. You know, it's a contract, you know, you're on contract. And basically, it was a way to make it a conflict of interest if they decided to collect signatures instead of basically sitting on their butts, right? The thing that that is really challenging is that money was actually, really challenging and sad is for those canvassers who were hired to collect for the referendum. They were really challenged and treated in really nasty ways. And some of them, of course, did agree to take money to just leave town. These are often people that make just over minimum wage. So it's completely understandable. But certainly, I don't know if any of you know Mia Lewis, but she is somebody who was out registering people to vote and was yelled at by a firm that was hired to harass the people that were collecting signatures for the referendum. And so even people that had nothing to do with the fight against House Bill 6 ended up being treated in really bad ways. And, fewer people actually ended up getting registered that day. When we start to think about kind of the consequences for democracy, it's just incredibly, incredibly sad. And I'm going to go back to the kind of original thing, that Joan talked about, that notion that democracy isn't something fixed, it's something that we're creating every single day, or we're destroying. And so, clearly this is a time where we need to beef up our democracy, and we need to have a real vision. When Michael was talking, you could just imagine a vision of what Ohio, what America could look like if, in fact, we valued people rather than valued corporations. And with that note, unless there's any other questions, I'm going to hand it off to Maria.
Thank you. Maria, tax and law.
Yeah. So, and also just another dirty tactic while we're on the topic is they actually started a fake petition to just spread confusion. So that was another just fun thing that they did. So no one knew what they were signing at any point. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen, and I am going to talk about kind of the boring part. Obviously, a lot of this, is icky, but what is illegal and why, right? So just to give you guys a little bit of background of what I'm, I guess, why I'm maybe qualified to speak on this topic. I went to law school, and during law school, I actually interned at the white collar crime division of the Southern District of Ohio's U.S. Attorney's Office. So I didn't work with this current U.S. attorney, but I did work with the one before that on white collar crime issues. And also, as I mentioned, I wrote my seminar paper on the 501c4 kind of loophole. And the reason that I did that is because what was going on at that time, that was 2013, and that was during the time when the IRS was quote unquote targeting conservatives. And so I wanted to look into what that meant and why they were, whether that was true, and if so, how that looked. And what I found pretty quickly is what they were really looking for was pretextual 501c4s, and they were using keywords that are often also included in conservative PACs, or in conservative organizations. So I kind of made this handy chart that hopefully is helpful. This outlines basically what different types of organizations can do. And the next screen, I'm going to highlight the ones that kind of matter. But the big thing to point out is like the C3 is the nonpartisan, safe church group, food pantry, those C3s that really have a public service component. That is the main goal, is the social welfare. C4s are a lot of things, as this fact pattern goes to show you, but they actually are, as an institution, not particularly troublesome. The only big thing is that they don't disclose donors, which, I believe would be a kind of a quick fix, is make C4s disclose donors. But they often, so for instance, C3s have limitations on the political activity and the type of political activity that they can engage in. C4s have some, but not as much. So C4s are often frequently a tool used by C3s that engage in lobbying and advocacy. And at the end of this presentation, I'm going to talk about the difference between lobbying and just engaging on an issue, because a lot of us, work among the C3s, and you might think, oh my God, I'm not allowed to do anything. And that's not true. So I'm going to kind of differentiate what you are allowed to do and what you're not. But I just, for this purpose, wanted to kind of show what C4s are allowed to do in comparison to other groups. So the appeal of the C4 versus a PAC or a C3 or anything like that is that they don't have to disclose their donors. PACs, on the other hand, do. Super PACs do. They also, though, are allowed to endorse specific candidates or parties, which C3s cannot do. But, and this is a really, really, really big but, the reason that this is a case, it cannot be the main purpose of the organization. The organization has to have an independent mission outside of getting a candidate or party elected. The other piece is whether they can coordinate directly with a candidate that they support. We just talked about how corporations have free speech through Citizen United. But another piece of that is whether they can coordinate with the campaign directly. Well, obviously in this fact pattern, we have Larry Householder talking directly to candidates. We have, the candidates specifically are involved in the discussion. So the whole, whether they were coordinating or not, is a little bit easier to distinguish when they are having those direct conversations. And then also the limits on individual donors is really important. So PACs and super PACs are subject to disclosure rules, and then PACs also are subject to individual donor contribution limits. C4s are not subject to either of those rules. So essentially, the operation can be simplified into this private company stuck a bunch of money into a C4 that does not have disclosure rules, and then they spent it on a bunch of things that otherwise would have disclosure rules. It really kind of is as simple as that. Obviously, Catherine's web is a lot more explanatory as to how the money moved, but the basic operation is this entity put money into a company that didn't have to, or into an organization that didn't have to disclose its donors, and then that organization really acted as a conduit for the private company. So I just kind of want to give a sense of like why the C4 was such a pretext. We talked a lot about the fact pattern, but let's look at NAACP. NAACP has a C4 and a C3. It's a great example of a functional, well-meaning, well-executed 501c4. Their mission statement is the vision of the NAACP is to ensure a society in which all individuals have equal rights without discrimination based on race. We know what that organization stands for. They are against racial discrimination. Their goal is to engage in work that prevents discrimination. Generations Now's mission statement, I actually pulled it up in the complaint while Catherine was talking. Organized exclusively for the promotion of social welfare and economic development purposes within the meaning of this part of the code and any future part of the code. There's no mission. There's actually no mission for this organization. And so, all of the activities the political activities that C4s are allowed to engage on always hinges back is their expenditure related to the mission of the organization? Is it a consequence of the mission of the organization? So they support candidates that also support their missions. So for example, environmental groups, they support candidates that believe in good environmental policy. There's a direct link between the mission of that organization and that expenditure. Even though it's political in nature, the main purpose of it is not to get that candidate elected, it's to get their mission further. So the definition of money laundering is when, and this is, I explain this because ultimately that's what this is. We got a laundry machine of the C4, and the definition of money laundering is the illegal activity that garners the money is placed into the launderer's hands. So right now we have the company A giving directly a householder past the campaign contribution through the 501c4. Right there, that's the illegal activity. Secondly, the launderer passes the money through a complex scheme of transactions to obscure who initially received the money from the criminal enterprise. You all saw the chart. It was pretty complicated. It was pretty convoluted. There were a lot of entities. The purpose was to obstruct who was actually controlling what. And then third, the scheme returns the money to the launderer in an obscure and indirect way. HB6, householder speaker. These are specific manifestations of this spent money. So they also could have still engaged in this type of behavior, but they could have done it legally. So how would they have done that? Well, company A would have spent money towards a political entity, but they would have been subject to the standard disclosure rules and expenditure limit rules. So they might have funded ads, but they would have to have, you know, their PAC underneath. Their PAC, we would have been able to follow the money without a surveillance project from the U.S. Attorney's Office. That's the main point of this, is they avoided that by allowing us to essentially get a dead end at Generation Now, that 501c4 laundry machine. Generation Now would have had some purpose other than to further self-interest of the corporation and the political candidate. This is, by its very nature, an illegal use of a C4. A C4 is supposed to have a mission statement that goes beyond this, specifically cannot have a mission statement that specifically is for the purposes of getting someone elected. And Householder and Co., they would have had used a leadership PAC, which is a different kind of entity, but that, again, they would have been subject to disclosure laws and contribution limits. So obviously I just talked a lot about what people can't do and why how they kind of slipped through the cracks on this, but I also just want to clarify the work that we are as C3 entities allowed to do. And so first of all, C3s can on a limited basis engage in so-called influencing legislation. They can engage in this to a percentage of their workload. So it is subject to the size of the entity. It's based on like how big their budget is, whether it's, I think the breaking point is like $1 million. They have a different percentage thresholds, but I think the highest is 20%, which means only 20% of their activities can be engaging in influencing legislation or getting a candidate elected, one of those two things. And what that means is there's two kinds of main types of that. There's grassroots lobbying and there's direct lobbying. Direct lobbying is what you think it is. They're contacting legislators. It's kind of the traditional route. The grassroots lobbying is affecting general public opinion through, you know, the ads, through the mailers, through the phone calls. All of those things are influencing legislation. They're just done through pursuing the public opinion rather than the specific legislature support. But here's all the things that don't count as doing that, because a lot of our work falls into this category. And so I just want to be clear that these are all things that are totally legal to do. And I got this right out of the tax code, so it's wordy and it's boring and I'm sorry, but I tried to at least bold the stuff that's important. Nonpartisan analysis of studies and research, totally fine. Technical advice based on the request of an elected official, totally fine. Appearing to engage on a subject that specifically affects your own organization, totally fine. And then communication with a government official outside of those, you know, influence a specific piece of legislation. So if you just go to lunch with a legislator because you're friends with a legislator, that's not attempting to influence legislation. So there are a lot of different ways you can engage in this work, and we do engage in this work all the time because we're not promoting a specific candidate or party. I did want to kind of speak to, just for a second, the piece about the contracting with the circulators, for the petition circulators. I don't know off the top of my head how you could prosecute that, because essentially you are two private entities engaging in a contract under mutually, you know, beneficial terms. This person's getting paid, this person's getting a benefit. And it's kind of similar to someone having like a criminal defense attorney on retainer, you know, because their argument, of course, would be, well, we might need them next year. So we wanted to make sure we had them shored up for next year's campaign, right? So I think that would be a pretty tough legal road to go down. It's icky. A lot of things are really icky and super legal. And I would probably put that closer into that category. The bullying and the intentional misinformation, maybe not so much, but the real catch to all of this is the misuse of that C4 entity. And that's it.
Questions? I have one. Would anybody care to, Maria or Catherine, talk about what you foresee as developments as we get closer to November? How will this impact the elections of House members, or maybe even some Ohio Senate folk?
I don't know how far the rabbit hole they'll go down, but I will say that anyone who received money stemming from Generation Now with the knowledge that it was actually from Larry Householder has technically engaged in this same money laundering scheme. Whether the prosecutor chooses to care about that is another question. But anyone who either specifically exchanged it for a vote or specifically exchanged it with the knowledge that it came from Householder in exchange for his support as speaker, really by definition is kind of in this group of people. I have no idea how big that group is though.
Yeah, one of the things that occurred to me, I don't, how many of you are from Cuyahoga County? So, okay, so do you remember when the arrests started in Cuyahoga County and then it just became more and more people, and it was like it was this taking off an onion and getting another layer and another layer. I think one of the things that's really clear in the complaint is that there are so much that we don't actually know. I mean, they didn't even say that First Energy was First Energy, Company A. Like we do, we know who it is, but it's clear that they have some work to do. I know for some of my environmentalist friends, the joke is often, I don't know how many of you love Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but First Energy being called First Evil is something that I've heard on a more than regular basis. What is interesting is, this notion that individual humans are getting in trouble. What about the corporation? What about the corporation's officers? Like, who actually made these kinds of decisions? And so, I think we're going to learn more. I popped this thing from Speaker Cup into the chat, and basically saying that he values transparency, he has a commitment to that. I think that what can often happen after a scandal is there's a burst of energy about doing the right thing, making changes. And the arrest did not come at a good time. Now, obviously, arrest didn't, if I were a householder, I'd say definitely didn't come at the right time. But for all of us, this is a time period where the legislature generally is not in town. We are before a major election. And so it is going to be up to us to keep improved disclosure, ethics reform, better information about lobbyists, and a variety of other kinds of reforms, including amending the Constitution. We need to keep those kinds of things in the public eye, as we're not necessarily very together, right? We're not seeing one another on a regular basis. We can't hang out at the Statehouse in the same kind of way. There are going to be some real challenges at organizing and holding these people accountable. And so if any of you are organizing forums, the kinds of, you can imagine the kinds of questions that we should be asking folks. We need to be putting pressure on, on the Statehouse. I picked up, I'm gonna grab this. I know, I picked these up. And I'm hoping people are willing to send postcards calling for, here we go, calling for them to actually pass good legislation. I think this is a time period where we should be putting as much pressure as possible. I'd like to believe that there would be real consequences when it comes to the elections, and there should be. But because of gerrymandering, it's very possible that even Larry Householder will win.
Well, he doesn't have an opponent.
Although there is a write-in.
It's so funny.
There's a write-in.
It's just,
yeah.
It's so sad, isn't it?
Yeah.
Maria Catherine, before I forget, it's been asked if you'll share your email in the chat so that
sure.
people are able to get a hold of you.
If you're interested in a packet of postcards, let me know and I will send them off to you.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then somebody speculated about whether the representatives who took money from Householder in exchange for their vote for him as speaker, if they even knew it came from Generation Now. That it's one of those things that may be forthcoming.
It would be like now we're getting into the specifics enough that I have to qualify my statements with us. I have to do the statute recently, and I don't know all the specific wording of it, and that's going to be clutch whether there's actually like something that can be prosecuted or not. But in my experience and knowledge, what I do know, I would think that some of it hinges on whether that in itself is a sufficient fact pattern, in the fact that, you know, he's still trading a vote for money. I mean, you know, that's still what the trade is. The other piece is, I'm not sure how much it matters whether they knew where the money was coming from. I mean, there are obviously disclosure laws, but, you know, it's kind of your responsibility to vet the money you spend, right? So that would also really be dependent on the language of the statute, because, you know, lawyers like to finagle around words where they can. So if there's even one word that kind of loosens up the law, they might be able to wiggle out of it. But I also think like these events and these kinds of conversations are really important because, you know, as Catherine and I explained, this is pretty blatant, it's pretty obvious, it's pretty impactful, but it's also really technical. And unless you're kind of in this world, I would think it would be very easy to write off as like just another, you know, politically motivated prosecution, or, you know, everyone knows money is involved or whatever. They wouldn't necessarily see sort of the criminal element of it. And so I think whether or not it impacts November is really going to come down to whether people understood what just happened.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I would like to highlight, just looking at prosecutions for bribery and with elected officials across the country, we do know that those cases are incredibly hard to prove. And it basically has to be, yes, Maria, I will give you this law because you gave me this money. Like it is.
Pretexts are really hard to prove.
What I say is, it's not enough to have the smoking gun. The gun has to be smoking. It has to be in the person's hands.
You have to be talking about how it's smoking out loud. And I think
yes.
that's
and so what I think is really important here is that the FBI took it seriously enough that they believed that they could make their case. And we know that in 2004, while there was a lot of stuff going on that looked super duper shady, they didn't think that they had enough.
And text messages sort of help everything because it's literally in writing a lot of the times. But yeah, no.
Let me text you about my bribe.
Right. Exactly. And so like without, you know, these literal physical proof documents as well as two informants, you know, that would be a really hard case to prove. But with those, you have like a direct quid pro quo. So it's like, this is an amazing case to prosecute. It's just a matter of how long it stays amazing as they trickle down the, you know, ring of people.
Alice has her hand up too.
Yes, I'm interested in those shine the light postcards, but I'd like to know what is the most important thing to recommend in shining the light? If I'm going to send a postcard, I want to be able to say, I want you to see that this happens.
So a simple way to talk about this, because it is not clear which bill is going to move. It's my educated guess at this point that it'll be House Bill 737, but I would rather wait before we jump on since they keep being introduced. It sounds like there's going to be it's interesting. The companion bills could be a Manning bill, so a mother-son team thing, which is kind of interesting. You know, I often think about the fact that like Governor DeWine and Justice DeWine and just the number of, shall we say, political families we have in Ohio. So that's a total side note. This is what you can say, you know, shining a light on dark money. You could say something along the lines of, close the dark money loophole. All Ohioans should be able to follow the money and understand who is paying for political ads. Now, one of the things I'll do when I send postcards to y'all is I can also give you some suggestions.
That would help. That would really help.
Get a little bit more information about these bills, and I have a better sense. Then we can say, hey, pass this bill. You need to change this, this, and this. And it'll be to make it stronger. But at the moment, we're talking about ideas.
Okay. And Maria had a good note in the chat here. And somebody asked, is there a list of other representatives who received money? And she noted that you should be able to search the donation records of candidates and line them up with the named entities. So if you want to see who was getting money.
Most of the journalists in Ohio are currently working on that, so you can also just like sit down for 2 weeks and they will probably have a list published somewhere. So
and I was gonna highlight that the PowerPoint that I put together, I started doing it as soon as I knew what as soon as Householder is arrested, I started putting together this PowerPoint, trying to capture a pic, like who are the people and what do they do, and I look like, when the FBI comes to arrest the bad guy and they have a wall of like crazy. I have a wall of crazy. But what's important here is that my wall of crazy was created not just because I looked at what the FBI had, but that I spent a lot of time looking at what journalists were doing. Like, what did Laura Bischoff put out? What are the things that are in the Cleveland Plain Dealer? Andrew Tobias did a bunch of different stories during the time period. So I went back and I looked at them. So I would encourage, democracy and local journalism are so connected. And we should all thank Jim Province from the Toledo Blade, who literally said, to DeVillers, hey, could we have avoided this if there was good campaign finance reform? Just that, we owe that Statehouse press corps for being on it. I would all encourage us all to be looking to see what comes in so our social media feeds, and look at our local papers really closely, because there's more to come.
And on that note, we are past our hour. It's already 8:10. So thank you all. Unless there's a burning comment or a final sentence that Maria or Catherine that you want to end with, and then I'll close us out.
So it's so easy to get depressed when you hear these kind of stories. And what I'm hoping is that we're using it to fuel an improvement to democracy, not to make us all feel like everybody's bought and paid for and that's that. I want us to take this moment, just like John Lewis talking about, hey, let's turn democracy into an action. I encourage us to take the mistakes of our elected officials and move us all to take action, because we are actually all the government, because we're in a democracy. So we should do what we can to change things. And thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you. Maria?
Yeah, I agree with Catherine, and I think similar to the John Lewis quote that he just mentioned. I don't know if everyone watched the Obama eulogy that he gave today, but if you haven't, you should. It's wonderful. But he does talk about how John Lewis's mother told him, the thing about knowledge is once it's in your head, no one can take it away from you. So I think that, you all just got a lot of knowledge, and now it's time to spread it and give it to a bunch of other people, because it's a strength and a tool that, we have to use.
And I will close with another quote from John Lewis then. These are words from his 1963 speech, when the struggle for civil rights had been going on for many decades, and people were saying, is this really ever going to happen? And he said, I appeal to all of you to get into this great revolution that is sweeping this nation. Get in and stay in the streets of every city, every village, every hamlet of this nation until true freedom comes, until the revolution of 1776 is complete. And thank you all for being here.